Thomas never imagined that a simple walk to his mailbox would turn his entire life upside down. It was a bright Saturday morning when he found a large white envelope waiting for him. At first, he thought it might be something minor, a reminder about trimming his hedges or repainting the mailbox. But as he tore it open and read the contents, his face drained of color. The letter listed violation after violation. His backyard shed was called unapproved. His wooden fence was described as painted the wrong shade, and even the flowers along his driveway were marked as non-compliant. Each accusation carried a fine, and at the bottom, written in stark black ink, was the total: $150,000. Thomas sat down on his porch steps, staring at the paper as if it couldn't possibly be real. He had spent years saving every dollar to buy his land, working late shifts and skipping luxuries most people took for granted. To him, this property wasn't just a house. It was a dream, a symbol of freedom, and the legacy of his family's hard work. And now, the association was threatening to strip it all away with the stroke of a pen. The following week, he attended the board meeting, hoping to resolve the matter. The room was filled with members seated behind a long table, their expressions smug and dismissive. When Thomas explained that he couldn't possibly owe such a ridiculous sum, the president of the board leaned forward with a cold smile and said, "Rules are rules. If you can't follow them, maybe this neighborhood isn't for you." Thomas tried to reason with them, pointing out that his shed had stood for years without complaint, and that his fence was the same color it had always been. But the board refused to listen. They waved their papers in the air, quoting rules and regulations, threatening him with foreclosure if he didn't pay up immediately. The more Thomas spoke, the more they laughed at his supposed lack of understanding of their authority. As he left the meeting, whispers followed him. Some neighbors shook their heads sympathetically, but when he asked for support, they lowered their eyes and muttered excuses. Everyone in the neighborhood lived in fear of the board. People had seen their friends fined for trivial things like leaving a garden hose out overnight or parking a car too close to the sidewalk. No one dared to stand up to them. For Thomas, the nights grew longer and heavier. Each knock at the door made his heart race. Each letter in the mailbox felt like another attack. But while the association believed they had cornered him, something inside Thomas refused to break. He knew there was more to his property than they realized. After all, his grandfather had once told him that the land he lived on had a history tied to deeds and documents much older than the neighborhood itself. With quiet determination, Thomas began searching through old boxes in his attic. He pulled out faded folders, yellowing maps, and property tax receipts from decades ago. What started as an act of desperation slowly turned into a mission. Every document he found was like a piece of a puzzle, hinting at something bigger, something that might change everything. The board thought they were tightening a noose around his neck. But in reality, Thomas was preparing for a fight they could never have anticipated. He didn't know it yet, but the letter demanding $150,000 would become the very spark that revealed the truth. The board wasn't the one in control. He was. Thomas spent the next few weeks buried under stacks of papers. His attic, once a dusty storage space, turned into his war room. Old boxes were dragged out, their cardboard edges frayed with time. He unfolded maps that smelled of age, tax receipts written in fading ink, and deeds signed by hands long gone. Each document told a fragment of a story, and the deeper he went, the clearer the picture became. Late nights bled into early mornings. The kitchen table was covered with papers, coffee mugs, and a small lamp that burned until dawn. Thomas's eyes grew tired, but his determination sharpened. Every new discovery hinted that his land wasn't just a single lot tucked into a suburban neighborhood. It was tied to something much larger, something most people had forgotten. Through county archives and dusty legal records, Thomas uncovered a trail of ownership stretching back nearly a century. His great-grandfather, a man known for his quiet resilience, had purchased not only the land where Thomas's home now stood, but also the vast stretch surrounding it. Over the years, that land had been subdivided, developed, and filled with houses. But somewhere along the way, mistakes were made. Filings were incomplete, surveys were misinterpreted, and legal descriptions were left vague. The result was astonishing. The entire neighborhood technically sat on land that still fell under his family's ownership. Thomas leaned back in his chair one night, staring at the documents in disbelief. It felt unreal, as though the universe had hidden this truth until the moment he needed it most. While the board members were writing fines against him, they themselves were living on land they had no legal claim to govern. But Thomas wasn't reckless. He knew he couldn't simply wave these papers around and expect instant victory. He needed to be precise. He spent hours cross-referencing deeds with maps, making sure every line matched. He visited the county clerk's office, quietly pulling more records and confirming every detail. Bit by bit, he built an ironclad case, one that no lawyer could dismiss as coincidence. Meanwhile, the harassment from the association didn't stop. More letters arrived, each one demanding payment, each one colder and more threatening than the last. Late fees piled on top of the original fine, and one notice even hinted at foreclosure proceedings. Thomas's neighbors began to notice his silence. Some whispered that he might lose everything. Others avoided him altogether, too afraid of being associated with someone targeted by the board. But Thomas carried himself with calm patience. Inside, his heart burned with a quiet fire, fueled not by revenge, but by justice. He remembered the smirk on the board president's face, the dismissive laughter when he had pleaded his case. They believed they had crushed him. But they had no idea that every document he uncovered brought him one step closer to flipping their entire world upside down. One evening, as he spread the final deed across his table, the truth settled over him like a weight lifted from his shoulders. It was no longer just a possibility or a vague hunch. The evidence was irrefutable. He didn't merely own his little patch of land. He owned the very ground beneath every house in the neighborhood, including those of the board members themselves. Thomas closed the folder carefully, his hands steady. The time for silence was ending. Soon the board would drag him into court, convinced they had already won. But what they didn't realize was that Thomas was no longer the man they thought they could intimidate. He was the rightful owner, and the truth was about to be revealed in front of everyone. The day of the court hearing arrived with heavy clouds hanging in the sky, as if the weather itself mirrored the tension in Thomas's chest. He walked into the courthouse carrying a thick folder pressed firmly under his arm. It wasn't just a collection of papers. It was his shield, his weapon, and his only chance to stand against the people who had tried to break him. Inside the courtroom, the board members sat confidently at their table, dressed in sharp suits, whispering to one another with smug grins. Their lawyer, a tall man with a polished voice, moved with the arrogance of someone who believed victory was already sealed. When Thomas entered, their eyes followed him, filled with the same dismissive attitude they had shown at the meetings. To them, he was just a stubborn homeowner who didn't know his place. The proceedings began with the board's lawyer laying out their case. He spoke with theatrical precision, describing Thomas as negligent, irresponsible, and unwilling to follow the rules that kept the neighborhood beautiful. He presented photos of Thomas's shed, measurements of his fence, and even mentioned the flowers along his driveway as evidence of constant violations. The board members nodded along, their expressions smug, as though every word pushed Thomas closer to defeat. When it was finally Thomas's turn, the room grew quieter. He stood slowly, placed his folder on the table, and began to speak. Not with anger, but with calm certainty. He explained that he respected order and fairness, but what he had endured was not fairness at all. Then, one by one, he pulled out the documents he had spent weeks gathering. The first deed caught the judge's attention. Then came the surveys, the maps, the tax receipts, each piece of paper layered carefully on top of the last. The board members' smiles began to falter. Thomas explained that his great-grandfather had purchased the entire stretch of land decades earlier, and through legal oversight, much of it had never been properly transferred. The homes built later, including those of the board members, still technically stood on property owned by his family. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The judge leaned forward, studying the papers intently. He asked for clarification, and Thomas calmly pointed out the signatures, the dates, the coordinates on the maps. A county clerk, called to verify the records, confirmed that everything Thomas presented was authentic. Piece by piece, the board's authority unraveled before everyone's eyes. By the time Thomas placed the final document on the table, the room was silent. The lawyer who had spoken so confidently earlier now shuffled his notes, struggling to find words. The board president's face had turned pale, his smugness replaced by disbelief. The very people who had threatened to take Thomas's home were forced to realize that they themselves had been living on land they had no legal right to govern. The judge finally spoke, his voice firm. The evidence was clear. The fines were not only unjust, but invalid. The board had no authority to demand them, and worse, they had exercised power over land that legally belonged to Thomas. The verdict was simple. Thomas owed nothing. Instead, it was the board that now faced serious questions about their conduct. Gasps echoed across the courtroom as neighbors who had come to watch whispered to each other in shock. Thomas didn't gloat. He didn't smile or raise his voice. He simply gathered his papers, placed them neatly back into his folder, and stood tall. The truth had spoken for itself, and in that moment, the balance of power shifted completely. The board had tried to bury him under fines and threats, but Thomas had risen stronger, armed with history and patience. As he walked out of the courtroom, the air outside felt lighter, freer. For the first time since the nightmare began, he wasn't the man being cornered. He was the man who had reclaimed what was rightfully his. News of the courtroom revelation spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. By evening, almost every doorstep buzzed with conversation about what had happened. The man who had once been the target of mockery and crushing fines had revealed himself as the rightful owner of the very ground beneath their homes. For many residents, the news felt like justice long overdue. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact with Thomas now found themselves gathering the courage to knock on his door. Some came to thank him, others to apologize for not standing by his side earlier. Many shared stories of their own frustrations, how they had been fined for planting trees too close to their fences, for parking an extra car in the driveway, or even for leaving children's toys in the yard overnight. For years, they had lived under the weight of unfair rules, always afraid that the next letter in the mailbox would demand money they didn't have. Thomas listened patiently, nodding as each story poured out. He had known the board was harsh, but hearing how deeply the community had suffered made him realize just how much power the association had abused. He could have easily used this moment to humiliate them, to seek revenge for every insult and every unjust fine. But that wasn't who he was. Instead, Thomas focused on fairness. Over the next few weeks, he worked carefully with legal advisors to dissolve the board's authority. The association that had once ruled with arrogance was stripped of its power, replaced by agreements that restored freedom to the homeowners. No more threats, no more endless violations. Families were given the right to make their own choices about their homes and properties. Some of the board members, desperate to save face, approached Thomas with apologies. Their voices were softer now, their eyes filled with unease. They offered explanations, claiming they had only been enforcing rules, that they never intended things to go so far. But Thomas simply reminded them of the night he had stood in their meeting, asking for fairness and how they had laughed at him. Respect was not something that could be demanded. It had to be earned. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted dramatically. For the first time in years, children played in yards without parents worrying about complaints. Families painted their houses in colors they loved. Gardeners planted flowers freely, and people decorated for holidays without fear of letters in the mail. A sense of freedom and unity slowly returned, and everyone knew they owed it to Thomas. He never tried to act like a ruler over them. He didn't impose new restrictions or demand special treatment. Instead, he became a quiet guardian, someone who had fought not only for himself, but for everyone around him. The neighbors began to look at him with newfound respect. They waved when he walked by, greeted him warmly at the grocery store, and included him in gatherings. The man who had once been an outcast because of the board's cruelty was now the heart of the community. For Thomas, the victory wasn't about power or recognition. It was about justice, about standing firm when others tried to strip away what was rightfully his. He had turned the tide not with anger, but with patience, persistence, and truth. The board had believed they were untouchable, yet all it took was one determined man to bring them down. At night, as he sat on his porch and looked out across the neighborhood, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The land his family had once purchased in hope and sacrifice was now finally free from the grip of arrogance. What had once been a place of fear had become a place of community again. And deep down, Thomas knew this was only the beginning of something greater. In the months that followed, Thomas's story spread far beyond the neighborhood. Local newspapers ran headlines about the man who had been fined $150,000 only to prove in court that he owned the entire community. Television crews showed up, eager to capture the tale of resilience and justice. To many, Thomas became a symbol of hope, a reminder that one person, armed with truth and determination, could stand against arrogance and win. But for Thomas, it was never about fame or recognition. While others marveled at the outcome, he continued his life quietly, just as he always had. He still mowed his lawn on Saturday mornings, waved to passing cars, and took long walks through the neighborhood. Yet everything felt different now. People no longer looked at him with pity or fear. They looked at him with respect. Children ran up to greet him, families invited him over for barbecues, and neighbors who once hid from the board now gathered freely, their laughter carrying into the night air. The board members who had once smirked and mocked him faded into the background. Some moved away, unable to face the community they had mistreated. Others stayed, but with lowered voices and humbled attitudes. Thomas never sought revenge, nor did he hold grudges. He simply chose to lead by example, showing that strength didn't come from control or threats, but from fairness and compassion. One evening, as Thomas sat on his porch, the sun dipped low across the rooftops, painting the sky with shades of gold and crimson. He thought back to the day when that first envelope had arrived, the letter that had nearly broken him. At the time, it had felt like the end of his dream, but in truth, it had been the beginning of something much greater. Without that letter, he might never have uncovered the hidden legacy of his land, never realized the power he truly held. He felt a quiet pride, not in the ownership of property, but in the fact that he had stood firm when it mattered most. He had protected his home, defended his name, and restored dignity not only to himself but to everyone around him. The neighborhood was no longer a place ruled by fear and fines. It was a place of freedom, community, and peace. As the evening breeze rustled through the trees, Thomas smiled to himself. He didn't see the land as something to lord over, but as a trust he carried forward, a responsibility passed down from his family. He had turned what could have been a story of defeat into one of justice and hope. His legacy was no longer just tied to dusty deeds and fading maps. It lived in the laughter of children, playing freely in yards, in the bright colors painted on homes without worry of punishment, and in the grateful smiles of neighbors who finally felt free. And so, Thomas leaned back in his chair, listening to the sounds of a neighborhood that had finally become what it was always, meant to be a community. The same letter that once threatened to destroy him had instead revealed the truth that sometimes what seems like the end is only the beginning of something far greater.